Kings 6. There's a lot of stuff going on, but this passage that I preached in the videos linked up here if you're on YouTube. But there's this one weird situation, and I talked about it just briefly on that Sunday morning, and that's what I want to talk about this morning. But I want to talk about cannibalism and consequences. So in the story, the king is up and he's walking on the walls of the palace or the walls of the city of Samaria. And this woman comes to him, and so Samaria is under siege, and it's been so for a long time, and food is extremely scarce. The story tells us people are starting to eat like donkeys' heads and cups of bird poop. And she comes to the king and says, listen, me and this lady struck a deal, and we killed and cooked my son and ate him. And now it's her turn for us to kill her son and cook him and eat him. And in scripture, they're babies, they're infants. But now this woman's hidden her son, so we can't cook him and eat him. And the king he tears his royal robes, and he's in anguish. But what in the world is going on with people killing and eating babies in scripture? And that's what I want us to talk about this morning, is because there's a lot of gnarly bits in the Old Testament. There's a lot of violent things in there, and a lot of times that's a struggling point for people, is why on earth and what on earth is going on here, and what should I do with this? And I want to help wrap my head around that in public with you today, as we kind of chase this rabbit trail. So a couple of things. Number one, God always comes to us in the context of time and people and place. John 1:14 said, the Word became flesh and made his home among us. At the beginning of John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and he was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him. And there was nothing made that was not made through him. And so God comes to us in a particular time, to particular places, and to particular people. It's one of the underlying just sentiments of Scripture. It's one of the underlying, just the foundational truths of Jesus, is seeing this is a God who comes to us in particular places, time, particular people. And so as bad as we think our world gets sometimes, and I'll tell you what, our world is pretty bad. It kind of scares me right now. But as bad as it gets, especially, I live in Louisiana, North Louisiana, in the United States. This is being filmed in 2018. We've got it pretty good, compared to other parts of the world, but especially compared to other places and times. You should go listen to Dan Carlin's podcast, Hardcore History, and hear about the brutality of the world in the past. And so we see violence in Scripture, one way, because it was a violent world, especially in the Old Testament. It was a very violent and brutal world. The things that we could not wrap our head around right now were kind of everyday norms, or were at least something to be legitimately feared by people. So the world was a very, very different place then. And remember, God comes to particular people, place, and time. So God is coming and speaking into this world of violence. The second thing is, to me, I began to understand and wrap my head around this idea of violence more when I began to understand really how the Old Testament shapes and shifts and moves, and how it was written and when it was written. And I think that the penultimate event in the Old Testament is this thing called the exile. It's when God's people had a broken covenant for so long that the nation of Israel divided in two, so northern kingdom Israel, southern kingdom Judah. This story takes place in the northern kingdom. That things are so bad that ultimately both kingdoms get carted off, and the northern kingdom just kind of disappears. The people that were of value were taken away and have kind of been lost to the stories of time. The people that did not have value were left there, and we find out about them in the stories of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. But also we find out about them in the New Testament by the people that are called the Samaritans. And they're kind of the remnants, the left behinds of this northern kingdom. The southern kingdom is caught off by Babylon. They're there for 70 years, and they're brought back. But this exile was the penultimate event. And if you look at the beginning of First Chronicles, you see chapters upon chapters upon chapters of these like lineage passages that most people find extremely boring. But what you realize is that the whole book of Chronicles in some way is about showing the line of the king, but also the beginning points of worship happening again. The Chronicles was written and has a lot to do with Nehemiah and Ezra, and when these exiles come back the second time. And in many ways, that begins the type of Judaism that we read in the New Testament, where these people who were once horrible, bad, would cheat on God, would do all these atrocious things. Now the pendulum swung and are extremely fundamentalist in their devotion to God. It's one of the reasons that Jesus drove them crazy. And if you look at this whole cultural movement, this movement of the Jewish people, and the movement of the Jewish people that we see in Scripture, it's a lot longer of a story than this GoPro video has. What we see is that the Old Testament really hit its final form. There's parts of it that are extremely, extremely, extremely old. But just like we have modern translations of the Bible, there's pieces and words and rhythms and types of literature that we can find in the Old Testament that helps us to see that just like we're used to modern Bible translations, in a way there was the editing and explanation done in the Old Testament that is somewhat akin to the idea of translations. And it hit this final form after the exile with these people who 2 generations ago had been idol worshippers and baby killers and all these horrible things, now come back as these like ultra observant Jews, and that they're telling these stories of Scripture. They're telling the story of their people. Remember, God always comes to particular people, place, and time. They're telling their story of their people in a way to say, don't ever do what we did again. Whatever you do, do not do what we've done again, which means they became double-minded and sacrificed to idols and worshipped other gods and all these things that led them to exile and death and destruction and horrible things. And so the story they're telling us is like, don't ever do this again. And once I began to understand this idea and read more people that are significantly smarter than me that talk about it, the more I began to see that there's this story of whatever you do, don't do this again, was huge in Scripture. It was really big in Scripture. And it kind of helps us shape and shift and understand that some of these horrible things are being communicated as absolutely horrible. So the people of God understand, don't ever do this again. So the story of cannibalism and consequence. Just kind of finished up that story of cannibalism, because it's like God always comes to particular people, particular places, and particular times. There's also the absence of God, and what the absence of God means in particular places, people, and times. And the story of the Old Testament is also a story of consequence. Like I said, this exile, this penultimate moment, is a story of consequence, and that everything that happens after the exile moment is a story of consequence. So you get the biblical stories of Daniel with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You get the biblical stories of Jeremiah, the biblical stories of Ezekiel, the prophet, and then Ezra and Nehemiah. And then the story of the New Testament is still part of this Hebrew, Jewish, Israelite, Old Testament, insert whatever word you want, inside of that story of consequence. And this is where we turn it back around to us. Because this story of this woman, and these 2 women making this pact to eat their sons, is a story of 2 individuals dealing with consequences. But also the larger stories of Kings is a story of the people of God and the people of God's consequence. It's the story of the nation of Israel splitting into 2. It's the story of Israel and Judah now eventually being carted off into exile as a result of the consequence of their breaking the covenant with God, of their consequence of allowing sin to reign in this country instead of God to reign. And remember, particular people, place, and time, and the role of the nation of Israel was to serve as a beacon of hope, both geographically, but also geopolitically and also culturally, to the reality of who God is. So, consequences. Big story of consequences. And we need to think about consequences. I mean, think of the news cycle in our world now as a story of consequences, a story of maybe people avoiding consequences. And we have to think about that in two ways. We have to think about that individually, but we also think about that corporately. So, in what ways do we understand and are affected by consequences individually? I think part of this is just to understand, to think that, you know, we have the capacity, each one of us as individuals, to simply be wrong, or to have made a bad decision, or for our behavior to negatively affect someone else. That's a growing thing in our world, that, you know, people just don't think there's consequences individually. We live in a system of self-referential behavior, maybe, is one way to put it. And so there's individual consequences that if enough people say we're a good person, that in theory might have the ability to outweigh what we did that negatively affected somebody else or somebody's else. That's somewhat what you see as the king dealing with that in the story. But you also have the corporate responsibility. What does it mean for us as the church now to see ourselves as of taking on this mantle of of Israel, of their call to be a beacon of the reality of God in their world? And so what does it look like for us to make our decisions, to look into mission, to lead ourselves, to worship? What does it mean for us as God's people to live in a world where there's consequences? What does it mean for us as God's people, for us now, to realize that God comes to particular places at particular times to particular people? So how do we see ourselves as part of not just our story as individuals? Remember this whole self-referential behavior we're doing now? But instead to see us as part of the grand story of God and what God is doing. So there's the rabbit trail. Really wasn't enough time to do that on Sunday morning, but I'm glad we had the time to do it today. I invite you just to share this with your friends and leave comments wherever you see this. We'll love to leave comments and hear what you think about it. So I'm Chad Brooks, and I am out.